Hello and welcome to this week's Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's weekly current affairs show. My name's Emma Webb, and this week I'm joined by Senior Fellow Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, Cultural Historian and Senior Fellow Philip Kiszely, and the Director of the New Culture Forum, Peter Whittle. So let's begin by talking about this story in the Times today, that the universities have scrapped challenging books in order to protect students. Philip, do you want to start? Yeah.
I always feel it's my fault when this happens. I'm not surprised. I'd be surprised if they weren't banning books. What it makes me think about is I think there's a sense that it reflects the broader culture, in the sense that reality and subjective reality have become about-faced, haven't they? So your subjective reality, and this is particularly the case with students, your subjective reality is everything, and anything that challenges that is actually a personal affront to you, and it will challenge your well-being. It will make you depressed. It will make you anxious. And so what they're doing is they're pushing this ideological agenda forward, but they're doing it in a way that's going to help you, that's going to be nice for you, because you don't want these nasty things. You don't want to be pushed to the perimeters of your experience. You don't want to look over the side and see new things. You just want the safe, comfortable stuff.
So we're going to get on later to various stories about the ways in which our institutions are not functioning the way that they should. But do you think that universities have ceased, are you talking about this sort of therapeutic culture, that they've ceased to be educational institutions, that they're now about therapy, basically? They're not
madrasas.
Well, the madrasas for a particular left-wing progressive ideology. But do you think that they're almost are being envisaged as these sort of therapy centres rather than educational institutions?
But what is it? What are they actually putting triggers up about? So Can we have an example?
So there a list. I've got a little list here. So the University of Essex has permanently removed. That's a quote. Permanently removed the 2017 Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Underground Railroad, apparently due to depictions of slavery. The play Miss Julie by August Strindberg has been withdrawn by Sussex from the English literature module because it contains discussions of suicide. Aberdeen University...
Anyone who's read Strindberg probably want to commit suicide anyway. It's such a dull read, honestly.
Put a trigger warning on that. Aberdeen University has told students that they can opt out of Chaucer and medieval writing because this is a quote, sometimes entails engagement with topics you may find emotionally challenging. And they've also put trigger warnings on a number of things: Shakespeare, Chaucer, Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, Charles Dickens, Agatha Christie.
There's a theme here, isn't there? They're all kind of like in the Western canon in some ways, aren't they?
Oh, and also Nottingham Trent University has told French students that they no longer have to study Charlie Hebdo, which is very interesting because that is obviously something that certain people would like to silence so much that they're willing to kill for it.
Well, they've deemed Charlie Hebdo to be racist, Islamophobic and homophobic and all the other phobics you could imagine. I can't say I'm surprised that we've got to this stage where we're coddling university students much as parents have coddled their children and schools are coddling their children. And when we live in an age of the microaggression where a raised eyebrow can now trigger trauma in somebody, it's not that surprising that people are getting traumatized allegedly by the idea of encountering true trauma in terms of what happened to slaves, for example. But in one of the stories was that Hemingway is being taken out, the old man in the sea comes with the trigger warning that there are graphic fishing scenes in this, you know. This was in a university in Scotland, you know, which has more millions of fish every year, and it can't take, you know, a couple of sharks and a whale or whatever being speared in this novel. But you know, Trevor Phillips wrote a very good piece about this, saying that this is actually patronising to black people and institutionally racist to say you can't take to hear what happened to your ancestors, because we have to admit, right, atrocities were committed under slavery, barbaric conditions. Why shouldn't people be able to see, hear and read about what actually did happen? And in a way, it's sort of erasing black people's stories here. And so even people who are advocates of you know, black history and the black experience are up in arms about this attempt to whitewash, all for the sake of saving people's emotions. And in my view, if you're not mature enough and resilient enough to be able to read Strindberg or any piece of literature without needing compress, you're not fit for university, and you shouldn't be going into university.
That is actually the purpose of great literature. It's supposed to make you feel uncomfortable, and it's supposed to make you experience feelings that you wouldn't otherwise be able to experience yourself.
That's the purpose of university as a whole. University is there to challenge you and to make you grow by actually countering your opinions with counter opinions and having you defend your opinions and evaluate evidence and determine what is valid and what's not valid.
The problem is these places are just marketplaces now, and students are seen with just a pound sign on their head, and they don't want to lose that money. So if a student feels uncomfortable, and the student is the consumer, so the student's always right, you know, and if the student says, well, I don't feel comfortable, I want to, it's the tail wagging the dog. It's the tail wagging the dog, and it's one of those instances where the market is in the wrong place. The market shouldn't be in education, not in the way it's in at the moment, because students will go, that naturally they're young people, right? So they're adolescents or just out of adolescence. They will go further and further and further with being special, you know, and being sensitive and being different. And there are no adults in the room. That's the problem. There are no adults in the room. There are no adults to say, no, this is a marketplace of ideas. This should, as Rafe said, this should be challenging, and nobody's saying that.
It's interesting, that goes back to what we were discussing.
Oh, for me, I'm saying that. I'm saying that, but other people aren't.
It goes back to what we were talking about last week with the infantilization of society in general, because things are topsy-turvy. If you go to university, the purpose is to learn from those who have the expertise. Now, we might put a question mark over whether a lot of the people in some of these academic particularly studies, degrees, departments, whether those people actually do have expertise that students can learn from. But it's putting the whole thing upside down, that it's the students who are saying, I want, and we're living in a society with no adults in the room who have a backbone enough to say, no, you don't get what you want, you get what you need. That's what education is for.
And just to add one further point, education, you're supposed to transcend yourself. That's the point of education. But what's happening is the opposite. So you're just going to reinforce all the stereotypes about your identity, and you can only learn from people who look like you. You can only learn from people who have had the same experience of you. The opposite should be the case, because you don't just want to be more of yourself. You don't just want to get back in your shell. You want to break out of that shell and take on the world.
But isn't it? Don't you think that the upshot of all this, at least it is for me, sorry Philip, because I know it's your livelihood, is just
to close them all down.
No, just don't go to university. I would say that to any young person. I mean it, really. Like, I've had a couple of stepsons, not stepsons, what am I talking about?
Godsons?
Godsons. What should I do and everything? This is a few years ago now, and I sort of thought, you could go, but you're going to come up against all sorts of stuff. I didn't want to kind of, make too bleak a picture, and you're going to pay hugely for the privilege. I think these places are rotten now. I think people shouldn't go. Well, you should do other things. Go and do other things. Don't bother with this. I'm sorry. I mean, I don't mean, because I know it's terribly important. I'm talking from a position of someone who grew up and still believes this is incredibly important, of course, but they are no longer doing what they should do.
But this ties it. Well, certainly there are far too many people going to university.
I agree completely. I really do.
There should be far fewer people going to university, and the whole value of a degree has been devalued by the fact that all these polytechnics were converted into universities under John Major, for example, and there are far too many graduates than there should be. And then we didn't do what the Germans did with apprenticeships, for example, far more valuable for people who aren't necessarily academically minded. But this goes back to the broader point of building our own institutions. And what America has done so successfully is establish these independent colleges and universities, foremost of which would be Hillsdale and Claremont, for example. And there's also the Bible Institute of Los Angeles that I've lectured at as well. And these are privately founded institutions that aren't tied to any left-wing ideology and believe in teaching traditional classics and the foundations of Western civilization. And it's high time that we established that. There's so much concern about universities in this country that I can't see why people can't get together and establish similar institutions in this country that are actually free from the and unfettered by ideology.
Well, there is Buckingham. There is Buckingham.
There is Buckingham.
But Buckingham started in the early 80s, I believe, and it's still the only one. And it's not like it's rabidly, sort of.
It's just a sensible institution.
Yes.
And I agree completely with what you say, Peter. But I would also say that there are individuals working in the system, running modules, running degrees, who are fairly sensible. I would say I'm fairly sensible. Eric Kaufman, Doug Stokes, very good friends of this channel. There are people there, and there are so I think for people who want to go to university, or whose children or grandchildren want to go to university,
find the right professor,
find the right people. That's what you should do. But also, if you're not ready, don't go. Really don't go. If it's not for you, don't go, because you're going to encounter a particular kind of experience. Let me leave it at that.
Well, the problem, of course, here, as I said before, is that finding the right person has become far more difficult. And I've said how many times on this channel that back when I was at university in the 90s, there were 2 liberals for every 1 conservative in the university.
Now you can
now
triple
that's
that.
Now that's 9 or 10 to 1. And in America, it was a 3 to 1 ratio, which is now 17 to 1 in America. So it's very difficult to find. I don't know whether I could have studied military history in the way that I did at university today, for example.
But the thing is, no one's going to say that they're a conservative anyway. I'm a minority of one saying it, crazily. But the atmosphere on campus is such that you really don't.
I think I just say that it's worth. I think we've discussed it recently, but the one group that is right at the bottom now of the league table in terms of entry.
White boys.
White working class boys. And I almost have to say, actually, guys, you're better off.
Yeah,
because if you were to go, you would be seen as the perpetrators of original sin for being exactly what you are. I would say this also too, it's young men mostly I'm saying about, when they say, what should I do in life, don't go into a company for the same reason. Don't go into a corporation. Your life will be miserable, right?
But I suppose then the question is, what do you do?
Right? You are, well, in that, yes, exactly. Be your own boss if you can. Start something if you can. There are some things, and even they're being, I think, slightly infected now, which are, I would always think the military is a very good thing, for example. It's a worthwhile thing to do. But generally work for yourself in some shape or form, whether it is a physical thing or whether it's a...
even the military's woke now, though, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. As I just said, it's getting that way. But avoid the corporation. You are going to have just, years of fighting this kind of unseen foe. And it's the same with universities, I feel.
So before we move on to the next subject, there are 2 things that I want to get your quick thoughts on. So the first thing is Arif Ahmed, who's an academic at Cambridge University, did a really interesting interview on Talk Radio. And one of the things that he said that I think we don't often, I've never heard this said before, but it's a very, very good point, which is that we're often asking what it is that has caused cancel culture. And he said what we should be asking actually is what prevented cancel culture over the last 300 years in the United Kingdom. Because actually that's the exception to the rule. Cancel culture throughout history, that kind of, I guess he means that kind of mob mentality that wants to shut down opponents and so on, that is not the natural state of affairs. So do you think that there is something that has blossomed in the UK, blossomed in Europe, you mentioned Western civilization, Rafe, that's blossomed here for the last 300 years, that it has now become eroded, and that's one of the reasons why the sort of tide is lapping at the door, trying to push the door down, as it were?
Well, it's the Enlightenment. I mean, the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason is what basically shone the light of reason into the dark recesses of superstition and mob mentality and mob views, and that's why you always had this sort of disconnect between the masses and the educated, those who were open to and were exposed to the Enlightenment, was that ability. And of course now, when we have this new era where people are told that the Enlightenment is no greater or grander than any sort of ritualistic, voodoo magic in the Caribbean or some ritualistic practices elsewhere in the world, everything is now, you've got moral and cultural relativism. People don't see the need to use those objective truths and to actually value learning and experience for what they are.
Peter?
Well, no, I would agree absolutely with Rafe. I think it's also best though not to overthink this thing too much, in the sense that we sort of know it when we see it. We know what cancel culture is about. They would like to cancel people like us, for example. it's about closing down, obviously something you don't agree with or don't believe in. The difference being is that people have always tried to do that, but now it is officially sanctioned by institutions all over. Institutions that were part of the Enlightenment. That is a big difference. It's a revolution from on the top downwards.
Do you think that it's the institutions that had traditionally protected that freedom being turned basically to enforcing it from the top, censorship from the top down? Do you think that's...
I do, but I think the answer is really simple. It's just technology, isn't it? We've got communication technology that we didn't have before. So this may well have had, if we would have had Twitter 200 years ago, it may well have happened then. It's just that we've got the mechanism, and bad actors have the mechanism to close things down, and by God, they'll do it.
So before,
but I would say that if you look, cancel culture has always existed in, say, India, in Islam, for example, right? If you write something about Muhammad there, you will be, but the book will be burned, you will be burned. If you are a woman trying to go out and go to school or vote or be too prominent for women's rights, you'll be cancelled in those cultures because they weren't exposed to the Enlightenment, right? Whereas you wouldn't have that here. So I think it's a bit more than just communication. I think it's the fact that our culture has been based upon tolerance and open to ideas and a plethora of concepts. And that's now the idea of having a wide spectrum of belief is now being narrowed, and we are, and what the glory of the West. I used to say, when did the Greeks stop being Greek? Now I'm increasingly saying, when did the British stop being British? All the things that made us into a great civilization, and what made the West unique were these values and these experiences, which are both Judeo-Christian and come from the Enlightenment and the classical world, and those are being eroded, and the narrowing of experience and of viewpoints is basically going back into a barbaric age.
Can I just one point about I think that I totally agree with that, but you have to say, well, why is this happening? It's a huge subject maybe, but could you say that it's happening in one direction on the whole, is it not? I.e. Western traditions. So is this the result of huge demographic change across the West?
I think that's part of it.
It's almost, you might look back at some point and say, well, of course it was that. A particular culture is being rejected in place of another.
But again, it's not just one thing. I think it's that. I think it's what Rafe says, but it's also when we started thinking in groupthink, particularly from the 50s and 60s. So it's our old friend postmodernism again. It's this idea of I'm this particular group, so I must promote my group no matter what, and then I become a subsection of this particular group and a subsection of this particular group. So you just begin to promote your identity above other identities, and that idea of promotion feeds into, it goes beyond equality. We're not interested in equality as a culture now. It's better than, isn't it? Women are better than men, trans are better than everybody. That's where it comes from. But
whilst mass immigration is the greatest threat to our culture and into the way of life that we've known it for the past few centuries, but it's not yet at a point where it is, I think, the primary reason for what we're experiencing. I think that there is an agenda here. It is institutional capture, which actually is using, and this is, let's not go back to the whole Gramscian thing, but it is that idea that minorities are being used and played to advance an agenda, given that the working class proletariat was seen as a failure to have achieved what the Marxists wanted to achieve, and they can now see that they can achieve that through not just immigration, but through identity politics, trans and all through all of those divisions. Those are the new things. So I think it's a combination of that. And if that's all I would say is, if things are as bad as they are now, if migration continues unchecked, one can only imagine how dire things are going to become.
There's actually a point, just to make the point, there is a point where the left let go of the working class, and there's a book by Leclau and Mouffe. It's from the mid-80s. It's about socialism and how socialism needs to change, and they say in it, essentially the working class didn't turn up at the revolution, so let's forget about them and let's look for other identity groups. So I think all of the things we're saying are correct, and I think it accelerates in the 60s and goes into overdrive in the 80s, and hey presto, here we're going
to have to move on to the next subject, but just before we do, and we'll have to be very brief, one of the things doing the rounds this week has been this photograph of a Liverpool University poster with the trans progress, or the Pride Progress flag, I think that's what it's called, and it says on it, genital preferences are transphobic. And I know this is a big question to ask for brief thoughts on, But how do you think they square that with complaints about things like rape culture on campus and the Me Too movement? Because surely to say genital preferences are transphobic is to coerce and manipulate people to do things against their orientation. Surely in many ways you would say that this is, you could argue it's homophobic.
I don't think they're that worried about squaring any circle.
No, exactly.
Say square pegs and round holes.
Yes, exactly.
But I think perhaps
floated through my head too.
you should perhaps explain what that actually means, gender preferences.
Oh, well,
genital preferences, sorry.
Genital preferences. I can't believe I'm being asked to explain this. But I presume what they mean by genital preferences is if you are a gay man and you prefer someone who is biologically male over somebody who is biologically female but identifies as male,
that's right.
then you are being transphobic.
That's right. So if you're a lesbian, you should should have no objection to being with a trans woman, a man who became a woman.
This is
with
what
a penis.
the LGBT alliance is all about.
Yeah.
This is basically that lesbians are being called transphobic because they do not want to go to bed, they want to go to bed with a trans woman, basically who's got male genitals but self-identifies as a woman, right? So therefore there is now a threat to just good old-fashioned being gay.
Yeah. So what you were describing in terms of the culture of the universities and everything, you can just imagine that the entire weight of all of that is on top of an individual, basically pressuring them to do something sexual against their own preferences, against their own orientation.
But the thing is, on one level, you're asking for logic. You're not going to get any logic from it. But on another level, it's entirely logical. If you want to smash everything up, if you want to completely obliterate our sense of moral value, our ethical approach, our sense of understanding in terms of categories, you go for this. It's the obvious thing to do. I can understand why they do it. I'm appalled by it, but I can understand it.
Well, it's like sowing confusion at the most basic level.
Yeah, the fundamental level.
Very, like, what am I? What is biology? What is science?
And again, trying to force people to betray their own judgment, to betray their own
to prevent their own instincts. If orientation is immutable, then how on earth can you be forced to I don't know, to be attracted to genitalia? That is not your natural inclination to be attracted to.
Yes, can I actually, at this point, which is another picture that did the rounds this week, was Wix. You know, Wix, the building. They have come out, like more and more companies are now getting on this political bandwagon. God knows, it must all come from human resources, I'm sure, all this stuff. But there's no LGB without T, which is what you're talking about. Yeah. In other words, you can't be LGB supporting unless you're also T supporting. There is nothing natural necessarily, or there is no connection necessarily between same-sex attraction and, being transgender or basically having gender dysphoria. There is no connection. But they make this connection, they forced it. So now we've got the likes of Wix saying, you feel saying, how dare you? How dare what do you know about this? How dare you?
Be and cue it. That's the answer.
So, relatedly, moving on to the subject of policing and the fact that, like, universities are not educating, the police are not policing. A photo that was a screen grab posted by Ed West on Twitter shows the Metropolitan Police with the logo of the Metropolitan Police with the crown on it, on top of a Pride Progress flag at some kind of rally, and you can see the police officers holding it. And underneath, the British Transport Police tweeted this. I'll read it out. It says, we love to see it, with a little clapping emoji. It says, inclusion isn't political and we'll always celebrate being as diverse as the communities we protect. If you're offended by this, please don't apply to work for us. Thanks.
If you read that, it means absolutely the opposite of everything it says. So it's not about diversity, but it's not about diversity of thought. This is ideological. It's not about inclusion, and it means it's completely the opposite of what it purports to be.
I think Ed West's post, his point was to say that basically, if you don't like my political, obviously I'm paraphrasing, so I apologise, Ed, if I've got this wrong, but that if you don't like my political views. But basically, they're just defining their political views as being not political.
Well, yes, it's being
that was a
decent.
very bad explanation.
Yeah,
so.
it's being decent.
It's ideological.
This is what I am, a decent person. So any decent, civilized person would think this, which actually is what the left used to be like. I mean, that's probably what the majority of the BBC like. They don't think that they're left. They think this is what any civilized person believes.
And so we've spoken recently about the arrest of I think his name is Darren Brady and Harry Miller in relation to the trans meme that the guy had posted. And there's been a lot of talk about two-tier policing and things like that, ideology within the police force. That's what the Bad Law Project is all about, run by Lawrence Fox and Harry Miller. And one of the other photos going around social media, which in a way I think is almost more concerning because it turned out to be an old photo, was of police smiling whilst holding the leashes of police dogs. Like they were like holding the leashes like they were police dogs, but they weren't police dogs. They were, how do you describe this?
Pup fetishists.
Kink dogs, yeah. Human beings dressed in pleather dog suits for kink purposes, and these police officers are holding their leashes like they're police dogs and grinning at the camera.
I think I looked at the image, and what was really interesting about it was how awkward and uncomfortable the two police officers look. And I thought, this is an image of...
They feel that they can't not take the photo.
They've been completely captured by an ideology that loathes them, and well, at least loathes what they're supposed to be. And they're not what they're supposed to be. But it was, I looked at the image, and I looked at it with something akin to despair, actually, because I shared it, well, you shared it, and it got thousands of shares, didn't it? But I shared it, and people had a different kind of response to it. People were laughing at it and taking the mick and all the rest of it, and that's an appropriate response. But lots of people were really, really angry, and I felt a combination of the two, but there was a lot of despair there. I thought, how have we got to this, where law enforcement is bound up with sex?
So you also have read this article this week about gang-related matters in London. I don't know if you want to talk a bit about that, because obviously the things the police are supposed to be policing, they are not getting a handle on.
Well, there are lots of statistics going around about, you know, they've made no arrests, or they haven't solved any crimes because they've got no time to investigate, because they're too busy dancing around with gimp dogs and all the rest of it. But this is a very, very serious story, and it was horrendous. It was one of the nastiest reads. This is essentially London gangs, and it didn't say anything else in the story. It was just London gangs, no description. London gangs who are systematically raping young girls as initiation ceremonies into their gangs. So this is Sadiq Khan's London. This is Pride London. This is the country in which we live in 2022.
Oh, it's utterly appalling. But the thing is, I think what you said there is the point, really, Philip, is that, you know, we have a police force. I think the statistic is quite incredible. It's like something like 80% of police have not made any arrests
in the last year.
Yes, this is extraordinary.
There was also a remarkable statistic about the amount of time that police officers had served. So actually, that most of the sort of bobbies on the beat haven't been police officers for very long. I can't remember exactly what the statistic was, but it was something like an average of 3 years or something to that effect.
But I think the point is that these other things, what you just talked about there, where I think it's a gang initiation ceremony. It's not the girls. It's the gang member.
That's what I mean. It's initiation.
Has to get the girl to do these sexual things. It's utterly appalling. But the fact is that the police obviously are not on top of it. I don't know how this report came about, but they are at pride marches, as you said. They are doing this, that, and the other thing. Nothing to do. Same with knife crime. Not being solved, not even being near to it. And you have to sort of say to yourself, well, are the police, or do the police actually even see themselves as enforcers of the law anymore at a very fundamental level? And in fact, is it actually just these rotten seniors in the police force? I don't think actually necessarily is. I think that actually this good old put upon Bobby on the beat figure we hear about, is that really the case still now? I'm
Well, of
not
course,
sure.
how many communities actually have bobbies on the beat anymore? And this is part of the community policing seems to have died to death. Now, we know that this is not inevitable, the situation that we have now, because it is a desperate situation that we have on the streets of London, for example, but also of Birmingham and elsewhere where these things happen. If New York could have turned itself around so dramatically in the 1990s under Giuliani and Bloomberg with the Broken Window Initiative, you know, a city with murders far beyond the entire, probably the whole national murder rate in the country, in the UK, was probably less than New York. Crime of a level that we've never experienced here. If it could go so far to becoming such a safe city, which now it no longer is, unfortunately, London is redeemable if the will is there, but there's no political will, and there seems to be no institutional will.
The thing is with that, actually, sorry for it, the thing with that is that they regularly do visits, don't they, to New York? The mayor, Boris, I think, went, certainly Sadiq Khan, when Giuliani was there. We're talking about Giuliani, aren't we? And now, of course, it's gone, as you say, way back, but that's largely to do with the defunding of the police and everything. Would it happen here? We always used to say, oh, why can't we do that here? And you sort of think, well, no, it would never really work here. Why would it not work here, actually? Is it because we're just simply too lily-livered, too mealy-mouthed? You know, is that the reason?
Well, the time has certainly come, because we have parts of this of London and other urban cities which have become completely ghettoized, and where you have people living almost feral existence who have no interaction with civilization, who simply live in this base for their base needs, and whatever will fulfill that at whatever cost goes. And you know, it's encompassing a far larger swathe of London as each decade goes by. And if something isn't done soon, then I think, you know, what our discussion today is going to be it's going to pale in comparison with what's going to happen in the years to come.
Do you feel a kind of general sense of low-level sort of anarchy? I mean, it's very easy to get paranoid about this, as you say. If you were in New York, Manhattan, say, like in the 70s, God, in the 70s and the 80s and everything, you could certainly feel that. I feel a sense of lawlessness, just a sense of lawlessness, sort of just bubbling away.
I feel that the culture that sustained the law is gone, and I don't know how long a legal system can continue to function and to protect liberty when the culture that led to it and upheld it is starting to disintegrate.
Well, it was 10 years ago this very month that we had the London riots of 2011, if you remember, and it was a tinderbox. It was so quick for people to lose their civilization, and the scenes that you saw. And in the past, of course, people were, remember, this was started as a civil rights issue, but of course, compare the civil rights marches in America, for example, where people would march with placards, to people basically just going shopping, trying on different pairs of trainers, which is quite a strange way of showing your solidarity with
great big
Black Lives
televisions.
Matter.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Actually, what happened with that was quite interesting with those riots, is that it was the first time I can remember where the whole poverty line didn't work. Because, you know, you always, people have got no food, people, and the reason for that is that everyone has got CCTV footage now. It's as simple as that, and you can put it up, and you can say, wait a minute, if this was poverty, you would be ransacking Sainsbury's, wouldn't you? But you're not. You're ransacking Currys or whatever else.
Trainers, labels.
And basically, it gave the lie entirely to this whole, because that was always the thing. It's about economic disadvantage. And people, that has not stuck.
Well, it's everything we talked about, isn't it? It's the police force turning into a service. Okay, it's education disappearing. It's a fundamental lack of respect. And how can you respect police officers that have gimp dogs on chains?
So I'm sure we're going to come back, no doubt we'll come back to the subject of policing in a future episode and talk about it in more depth. So let's move on to this story. I think it was in the Telegraph. Tom Daley, the Olympic diver, pardon the pun, coming out and saying that the British Empire is responsible for all of the homophobic laws that exist in the Commonwealth countries that were formerly within the Empire. So he's done this documentary series for the BBC, and this is the quote describing, he says, he discovers the colonial legacy that first criminalized homosexuality and the toxic influence of slavery towards LGBT people. And it talks about basically the legacy of empire left in legal codes of those post-colonial nations.
Who wants to go first?
Rafe?
Well, look, no one can deny that the legislation that was put into place in the 19th century was inherently homophobic, yes, and it was, but that wasn't just in British colonies, it was in French colonies too, and German colonies, Portuguese colonies not so much. But if you look at the ranking of countries in Africa that are homophobic, you know, the top 10 are half Portuguese and half British too. But of course, the British were just the ones who codified the first laws. That's not to say that homophobia wasn't rife in those countries long before the British arrived. And certainly, if you look at India and Pakistan, they had lots of, and then in Hindu laws of those countries, there was lots of homophobia was present there. So it's certainly not something that the British didn't introduce. They may have codified it, but it's certainly. But the other point, of course, is well, look. 75 years have passed since the end of empire. Those countries don't seem to have evolved very much in their legislation. When you still have imprisonment, I think Uganda, you can still be put to death. Those aren't things that you can lay at the feet of the British, I don't think.
It's one of the bizarre. Sorry, Peter. It's one of the bizarre things about identity politics and identitarians, leftist identitarians. They rewrite traditional communities in Africa in the mould of a 21st century Western. It's incredible that they do it with such a straight face. Now, Tom Daley's stupid. Okay, so he's going to say that because he doesn't know any better. These other people do know better. They know what they're doing. It's the same thing with the police. It's the same thing with education. It's
a strangely colonial attitude.
To
think that in 75 years that things couldn't have been changed if it was the fault of the British Empire. Because one of the points that has been made, so Rupert Myers, a barrister, has pointed out that theocracies like Saudi Arabia obviously
exactly.
Yeah, but the thing is, that's the whole point. The point about this whole argument is that we shouldn't sort of be having it. Any commissioning editor who had any kind of courage or even grasp of the situation for gay people would immediately say, we're sending Tom to Qatar. We're sending Tom to Saudi Arabia, to Iran, to Iraq, virtually every Middle Eastern country apart from Israel.
And we're going to give him a degree on the Ottoman Empire. We're going to make him read about the Ottoman Empire.
But the purpose, of course, is again, everything must be seen through the spectrum of slavery, and therefore every single wrong in the world must be put down to the British Empire. So homophobia, when legally codified, must be the legacy of colonialism.
Even though Iran was never colonized, for example.
Or Saudi Arabia.
No, it's true that Africa is very evangelical, and the evangelical faith, of course, which was brought by missionaries, is also not very welcoming towards gay people too. But of course, none of that detracts from the fact that it's ever been thus in Africa.
And these people are disappearing traditional cultures. It's awful. It's awful. It's racist.
But it's this inability to actually ever criticise an African country. It has to be Britain's fault. You know, this is remarkable.
So just before we wrap up, let's talk finally about animal rebellion. It's an offshoot of Extinction Rebellion that have been seen this week pouring milk. They're vegan activists. They've been pouring milk all over the floor of Harrods. And apparently they're doing this to raise awareness of the dairy industry and climate change. They want to, according to an interview that one of their activists did, they want to free up 76% of land from farming, which presumably will be just stolen from farmers, so that they can use that land for rewilding. So this goes back to what we were discussing in previous weeks around the net zero targets and the farmers in the Netherlands having their land taken away from them by the government. That seems to be what these guys are trying to achieve, but they're trying to achieve it by pouring milk all over Harrods floor. What do you think about that?
I don't think they're even trying to achieve that. I don't even think that they've got the grasp that you just showed there of the issue. I think that they're just stupid middle-class activists, right? Who, this is the current thing. I remember them from university. I'm sure we all do, right? They want to sort of damage things, want to basically spoil things which were the traditional way, whether or not it's meat, whether or not it's dairy, whatever, anything that's seen as masculine, all of these things, right? So they go along to Harrods. Always, you know, it makes me laugh that they go to Harrods. Why not go to, I don't know, a little Tesco Express somewhere down in a suburb? No, it's Harrods. I think they should just be...
It's probably where they shop.
Who was it said someone should tell them to just lick it up?
Oh yeah, that was me. That was me. As soon as I saw it, I could hear my grandma's voice saying, "Make them lick it up."
Well, actually, there's a really important point there, because who is going to clean it up? It's going to be cleaners on minimum wage.
Yeah.
That's who's going to have to clean it up, and not the activists.
And people who also have to buy food. You know, it's the insult of these people, the insult that they.
There's a really good point in that, because particularly given the whole cost of living crisis, that there are people who can't afford their weekly shops, people who are at the lower economic bracket, who are seeing things like milk and eggs and all of these things going up by just enough that they might not be able to afford it in a short period of time. And you have these middle class activists who care so much about rewilding and climate change that they're happy to just buy, probably they may have even bought the milk from Harrods, I don't know, but buying milk and then just wasting it, pouring it all over the floor, it's an insult.
So again, I think the oxygen of publicity for this stuff is no good for them. It's good for us, because we see, as Peter just said, it's stupid, and we see how stupid they are, and we see how spoilt they are, and it's more of the same. So let's see as much of it as we can.
Afraid they go home probably to a yummy mummy and a woke daddy who says, "Oh, well done, darling." You know, it's just good to see youthful spirit. You know, I mean, it just appalling. You know,
it was a wasted opportunity anyway. I used to live opposite Harrods, and I can tell you, you only get two types of people in there: tourists and Arabs who spend 3 months of the year here. So nobody would actually have seen this stunt to count. So.
I feel like maybe these vegan activists are the ones that are supposed to be, would probably do well to be exposed to some of that those graphic C images that you were talking about before.
Yes.
David Attenborough, Blue Planet style. So on that note, we're going to have to finish this week's episode. Yeah, we could go for another hour or more, I'm sure. So thank you, Peter, thank you, Rafe, thank you, Philip, and we will see you next time on Newspeak. Please like and subscribe, and thank you very much for watching.
Hello, if you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.